All right, I'm going to get started. To be fair, for all those people who actually logged in on time, I don't want to keep them waiting. More people are still logging in, but we said 1 o'clock, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar. Super excited to be here. We had over 450 people sign up for this webinar about speed to hire, discovering what agencies that are thriving have learned about hiring during the pandemic. Clearly, it is something that's top of mind for everyone in the healthcare industry and particularly the home care industry. I want to thank Jen Thaben from and the rest of our marketing team for putting this together. Really great job of getting the word out there, getting the message out there. And as I mentioned, we've got a really a great number of people who signed up today, and we're super excited about that. One housekeeping item, our chat is open, so any questions you have, it's being monitored throughout the webinar, and feel free to chat. Any questions that you'd like to ask of myself or any of the panelists on today's webinar, feel free to use the Q&A functionality, post your question there. We'll review them towards the end of the webinar and direct them to the appropriate panelist. Today's panel is made up of myself. My name is Avi Singer. I'm the CEO and founder of showd.me. We focus, as many of you know, on healthcare compliance as well as onboarding and orientation for healthcare employees. It's our privilege to have today with us Efy Tennenbaum, Chief Corporate Officer of Preferred Home Care. Many of you may have seen Preferred's name in the news recently, as they were recently acquired by Help at Home. So super exciting time for Preferred, and we really appreciate it. I'm sure you're really busy, Efy. We certainly appreciate you taking the time to spend some time with us, and I think the audience is really going to get a lot of value of what you have to offer. We're also really privileged to have somebody who I appreciate a ton. When I started working in the home care industry back in 2017, 2018, whenever I had a question about agency management software, how technology works, how the industry works, we were very fortunate. We've been fortunate to have HHAeXchange as partners of ours for a really long time. And my go-to person at Exchange for all these technical questions I had about the industry was John Pandolfi. So I certainly appreciate John being that go-to person that I've had over the last few years for all the questions I've had, and really appreciate him being here today and making the time to be with us today. So thank you, both of you panelists, and I think the audience is really going to get a lot out of what you have to share today.
Thanks, Avi. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Excellent. Before we get into the panelists, I want to share a couple of things, some work that we've done here at showd.me about understanding the challenges that agencies are facing. Not just due to the pandemic, which of course has had some real challenges, created some real challenges, but even prior to that, or even currently, some of the challenges. And we see this as a very, very complex area. When you look at what we call the recruitment management value chain, there's two sides to this marketplace, and many of you will recognize these. You've got that aide, you've got that caregiver who's looking for a job and trying to go through the process of getting all the paperwork, getting all the training that you need to do in order to get that role. And then on the other side of that marketplace, you've got the agency. And the agency, of course, has patients that they're onboarding and then going through the intake process on, and hoping to be able to match them up with the appropriate caregiver at the appropriate time, right? So you can see both sides here. There's the need to be able to apply for the job, you need to be able to manage your applications, paperwork, and all those things. And because of that complexity, there's a lot of different tools that agencies are using to manage this process, whether they're leveraging job boards, applicant tracking systems, various onboarding tools and training tools, HR systems. There's a lot that has to go into this. It's not a simple thing. It's not this simple, hey, somebody walks into our office, they fill out their paperwork or they fill out what they need to do, and they're able to simply get a job. There's a lot of things that go into this. And of course, while the process is the same, no matter what the size of the agency is, of course, it is complex, much more complex when you try to do this at scale. So these are some things we're going to focus on today, literally moving from left to right. How do you post those jobs? How do people find those jobs? All the way through that final HR paperwork that needs to get done so that caregiver can actually start their role. We recently here at showd.me launched some research that we did. We received responses from over 400 people in the home care industry, and wanted to find a little bit more about some of the challenges that they've had over the last couple of years in both recruiting, developing and retaining talent. So I'll talk a little bit about an upcoming webinar. We'll have to go over those results. But in light of what we're going to discuss today, I thought it'd be helpful to share at least a couple of data points with you. Number one, and perhaps it still seems shocking to me, even though I hear these numbers on a daily basis as I talk to agencies, but in our survey, in our poll that we did with home care agencies, 89% of agencies say they did not meet their hiring goals in 2021, right? It's both devastating from a business standpoint. I feel there's my personal thought, not being able to staff cases, not being able to grow your business because you can't find the employees. I think it's also a huge challenge from an employee standpoint, from a patient standpoint. When you look at that number and realize that there are patients out there across the United States, and we're very fortunate to have literally I don't know how many states are represented on this webinar, but we've got a lot of different people from across the country, and this is pretty universal, right? That there are unfortunately today patients who are not getting the care that they need because simply we can't meet those hiring goals, we can't meet those hiring needs. One thing that we did find really interesting in here, and one of the things that we'll focus on today, we talked about speed to hire, right, is that there's still this sort of thought that perhaps it's taking too long to get caregivers on board, right? Perhaps the onboarding process, the orientation process, and especially in this industry where there isn't really an office that they're going to work at, right? Their office is going to be a patient's home. Perhaps there's a way that we can speed this process up and move things along, right? So we found that 68% of all caregivers are taking over a week to complete their onboarding orientation. And we'll talk a little bit about today about how potentially you can speed up that process without sacrificing quality, of course, but speed up the process so you can get more hires in the door. And finally, the final statement that we thought was really, really interesting was that 75% of the respondents to our survey felt that if we had a simpler, more convenient way to complete orientation and onboarding, we would have hired more caregivers, right? So I think a lot of you out there, and certainly the people who responded to this research that we did, felt like there's more that can be done. And that's really one of the reasons we put together this webinar today, because we feel that you're right, there is more that can be done. And we feel like Preferred and certainly a lot of HHAeXchange's clients have come up with ways of improving orientation and onboarding, and we will share those today. So that's just a couple of pieces from our State of the Home Care Industry survey that we did. We will have another webinar, a little plug here, a webinar on May 10th to go over some of the results from that survey. And of course, not just the results, but some practical ideas, practical applications potentially for the results that we had. So before we jump into a couple of questions I have for our panelists today, we thought maybe we'd poll the audience here and see, in 2021, did your agency meet their hiring goals? So we're going to pop up a poll here for a second. We'll share the results in a couple minutes, but just to kind of get a sense of the audience, in 2021, did your agency meet their hiring goals? Give another few seconds for everyone to put in their answers, and then we will share the results. All right, let's see what we've got. Wow. Okay, I'm laughing because the numbers. I'm laughing because the numbers exactly we got on our survey as well, which is just phenomenal, right? I always love when you can validate research, right? So 89% of people, 89% of respondents said their agency did not meet their hiring goals in 2021. So we're consistent there. I think everyone on this audience is a good representation of what we found in our research. So again, everyone's acknowledging that this is a huge challenge. Let's move over to some of the questions we have for our panelists. And John, I want to start with you. I think you've got a very unique purview of the broader audience. I don't know how many states HHAeXchange actually works in, but I know it's a number of different states. So before we come back to questions around specifically onboarding orientation, what are some of the other big challenges that you're seeing home healthcare agencies dealing with in 2022?
Yeah, great to be here, Avi. Like I said, thanks for organizing this. So yeah, our purview, we're in many states, but we have large presence in several smaller states. The increased burden on the industry and especially the caregivers. So they already have a huge burden, right? The work that they do is challenging, it's difficult, the hours are tough. What they're being asked to do is physically demanding and kind of mentally demanding. That's one thing, but it's only going to get more demanding, right? We see in almost every market that we work in this push towards value-based care. And what that means in my eyes is leveraging the caregiver to collect more, to do more, to make themselves aware of more things. So I see that as a pretty large challenge, right? Convincing them that what you're doing today, it's awesome, it's excellent, but we want a couple more things out of you, right? And so, that to me is a challenge. Second, I mean, this is a fairly obvious statement, but it's the competing industries. For all the things that I just mentioned, what's going to make a worker enter this industry? I mean, I think there's a couple bright sides to it. It's very fulfilling. It lends itself nicely to the gig economy. So I can work here, I can work there. I can on some level choose when I want to work, which I think is super important to people of this generation. And then lastly, I would say is just the changing compliance landscape and requirements. So in almost every market that we work in, there's now lines in the sand about EVV and aggregation and will you get paid for claims. So not every market, but the ones that have these lines, they're fairly strict and they're meaningful. So will you as a company invest enough of your resources to understand and implement these compliance changes, because they're going to start affecting cash flow. And when that happens, how will you react? So I think those are the three biggest, Avi.
Yeah, that's great. So you're saying there's these external sort of forces, right? The other industries, other opportunities, potentially paying higher rates, right? For pretty much the same kind of person who might work in both industries. And then on top of that, some of the internal challenges that we're going to have, whether it's EVV, right? So just adding a complexity to an audience that, I think we can all acknowledge has challenges sometimes with technology and access to technology, certainly. But then also asking, caregivers to get involved in other things like improving care, right? So it's not just this sort of baseline. Yeah, there's a lot, right? That's a lot. So yeah, I mean, one, you can attract people into the industry, but then how do you keep in the industry when there's certainly some challenging things going on? That's great. I appreciate that, John. Efy, moving over to you. If I can move the slide forward, here we go. Oops, I went too fast. From a more micro kind of standpoint, right? You guys are based in New York for the most part, Northeast for sure. What are you seeing as some of the biggest challenges in getting people to come into this industry and work in home care?
Yeah, that's a good question, Avi. Thanks for again having us today. I think every agency is going to struggle with their own individual challenges, but when we look at the industry and some of the other large agencies and the small mom and pop shops, I think there's some common denominators that we all share in common. Some of the things that come to mind is, we never lose focus of the fact that there's an aide behind every hire. Although we would love every aide to come in day one, fill out an application, come in with all their documentation and be hired within 24 hours, we know that's just not the way it works. So there's an inherent timing issue where these things tend to take time. And no matter how good of a job a large or a small agency does, we are still always going to be, and we should be, at the mercy of the comfort level of the aides, the caregivers. Some may need a longer period of time, some may need a shorter period of time, and we always need to be mindful of that. They ultimately will drive the speed at which we can hire. Now, we can do a number of things to encourage them, to incentivize them, to make them more comfortable, to make them adapt. But at the end of the day, it's always going to be up to them in terms of timing. I think another thing that agencies probably tend to deal with in terms of a challenge is probably the consistent language barrier. We know that everyone that comes to work in our industry from a caregiver standpoint, English is not necessarily their native language. we try and we need to do a very good job making them comfortable that when they do need to converse with us, they're able to do it in a comfortable and acceptable manner. That is not only when they have a payroll issue, but even when we're trying to onboard them. So I think the more agencies can do in terms of making that experience really comfortable for them, and language barriers is certainly something you want to tear down. The more success agencies will have in being able to bring those caregivers on board.
Got it. So it sounds like what you're saying is just a lot more awareness, right, around not the challenges. It's almost flipping it around, saying it's not the agency challenge, but being completely aware of the caregiver or that person who's applying for the job, some of their challenges, and addressing those challenges are probably the big challenges that you're dealing with. Just for, I don't know if you're comfortable sharing or not, just for context for audience. I mean, how large is your agency?
So here at Preferred, we have, I mean, not to get into every detail, but we're north of 10,000 people in the field.
Got it. Okay. So definitely something you guys think about all day long, for sure.
I just add, Avi, I mean, every challenge that an aide has, we have. So they for us, they go hand in hand. They're one and the same.
Got it. And so maybe we could dig into that a little bit more. What do you find to be, I mean, the language barrier is something that you mentioned. What do you find to be some of the more complex components of the onboarding process? And how do you go about dealing with those things? If you can just get a little more specific around them. Yeah,
sure. So again, I try to, respond to these questions, from the purview of what we deal with, what our teams deal with on a daily basis. And again, it's really across the spectrum. So obviously getting hired as an HHA, a PCA, a PA a little bit less, but at the end of the day, it's a process. They need to go through a number of hoops and jump through those in order to ultimately get hired. Some of them they have in their control, some of them they don't. So for example, obviously there's many documents that an HHA or PCA, certainly here in New York, are going to need to bring in and satisfy in order to get hired. We're talking about everything from medicals, certificates, reference letters, work verifications, I-9 documents. It's a lot. It's a lot that an aide needs to pull together and ultimately meet those requirements. Certainly during the pandemic, items such as medicals became more difficult and challenging as urgent care shut down, clinics shut down, physicians' offices were not seeing individuals as readily as they did in the past. So that certainly presented its own challenge during the period of time that we had a limited ability to get the aides their completed medicals. But even when things are fine, there's still a lot of items that they do need to pull together. And that presents a challenge. And obviously every agency has to figure out how to work with those candidates to ultimately, satisfy the internal requirements.
Got it. Yeah. So like going back to that sort of that value chain, right? There's just all those little pieces, and you've got to not only think about how do we get that, our side of it from an agency standpoint, but is that caregiver, is that aide going to be able to do their side as well? Last week, Efy, when we were talking, you mentioned something that I think is valuable for our audience to hear about, sort of the attitude that you have about this, right? It's frustrating, it's challenging, right? But technology challenges, language barriers and things like that. But you mentioned something about the attitude that you have at your agency that sort of permeates through all these sort of frustrations and challenges from an agency standpoint. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to make it sound like a cliche, but Avi, thank you. People talk to me all the time about, we're obviously pretty large. We talk about some of the things that normally keep me up at night. We're in a very large industry, obviously, and very, very often our teams, and we've got many teams and many departments, we look at everybody as a admission ID number, or we tend to look at people as what we call a PHN number in terms of a candidate to hire. But behind every one of these alphanumeric numbers is an individual. We have an aide, we have a caregiver who does not get paid a lot of money. Very often in the industry, they're getting paid minimum wage, which is a very nominal amount of money. and they go out on a train, on a bus, or they walk a half a mile in the heat of the summer or through the ice of the winter, and they're going out to take care of an 85 or a 95-year-old female or male who may be all alone, living in a very, very small apartment. And this is the only individual that really is able to take care of this person, has their finger on the pulse in terms of how this person's doing. They're in a very noble profession, but obviously it's not the most glamorous profession. We try to understand, we really do, what each one of these people are going through in their life. We understand they have a personal life, as we all do. And at the end of the day, these are the people that the families, the patients, and we as a company rely on to ultimately deliver the care that we would want for our own parent or our own grandparent. So we understand that they have a life, they have a lot of things going on in their lives, they have children, and we have to get it right with them. We have to get it right from the point of hiring, and we have to work with them to help them meet the requirements. Much of the time, they do want to get hired. They want to get hired expeditiously. Very often there's items that are holding them back. It's not just them not sending items in. Very often there's just items that they're waiting on themselves. So these things, tend to keep us up, along with the fact that because they're in such a noble profession and that they don't make, as much money as perhaps they should, we want to make sure, obviously, things later on are right as well, not just on the onboarding process. And that's things like getting the payroll right and making sure that although they don't make a lot of money, it's really important that when they're relying on our paycheck come Friday so they can feed their children and they can purchase the things that they need for their family, we can deliver. So we try to look at it from that perspective, realizing, obviously, as I'm sure everyone on this webinar today does, that these are individuals that need to be well taken care of. That starts at the beginning, and we try to do everything we can to assist them from the very beginning all the way through employment.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. I think that's, I'm fortunate, to work with, we work with many agencies, and, I think it's amazing how, it could be so easy to forget some of the things you just mentioned, right? The fact that, there's a human being here, right? These aren't just widgets, right? There's a widget that needs to be serviced, right? So we need to find someone to service it, but these are human beings. The patients are human beings, the caregivers are human beings, and you're expecting a lot from them. Right. And they need to see that, to your point, they need to see that in the onboarding process, that you value that and that you appreciate that. And if you can, then perhaps, yeah, they're going to choose to work for your agency. I think everyone recognizes that when someone applies to a home care agency, there's lots of options, and potentially they're applying to multiple agencies. But if they get that sense from you that, hey, we're here to help, we're here to get you through the process, we want you to come work for us specifically, I think that's amazing. I think the other point you made at the end is really an important one as well, around getting things right early on, right? You can spend so much money on marketing and advertising and the onboarding process and the paperwork and all these other things that agencies go through. And then that first week, maybe their paycheck isn't accurate. Maybe they haven't been able to sign up for benefits. They haven't been able to clock in and clock out properly, or whatever the challenge is. And, that's it. They're going to move on to that next agency. And I think that's such an important thing as well, that, hey, you're our responsibility. We've hired you. You've gone through the process. We're going to make sure that your paycheck is accurate. And we're going to make sure that you're able to sign up for your benefits and receive them, in a timely fashion. And yeah, I mean, again, I can't even begin to imagine how much of a challenge it is to do it at scale and then across multiple languages and locations. But certainly, again, I think it's a challenge for everyone on this call, right? Is that making sure the onboarding process, you're really impressing them and showing them how important it is. But at the same time, also, once they start, don't forget about them. Say, oh, you started now, so now we can kind of, just assume you'll keep coming to work. But we certainly need to do other things. I really appreciate that, Efy. John, moving back to you. I mean, again, I want to use your perspective of the, I don't know how many agencies you talk to on a daily basis, but you certainly talk to a lot on a daily and weekly basis. What are you finding in some of the conversations you're having that agencies are doing, to overcome some of these challenges, get applicants through the onboarding process?
Yeah, good question. So I think, as a technology vendor, making sure that every decision they make is caregiver focused. I think from our standpoint, if I'm just going to kind of go on a tangent for a few seconds here, a couple of years ago, all decisions that we made were really agency centric, right? They were, what does Efy think about this decision? What does Preferred think about this decision? That was in some ways an antiquated way of approaching it, especially this industry. So we had a mindset change. And so I think a similar mindset change we had, an agency has to have about every decision that we make, how does it affect the caregiver? They're not directly our clients. They don't pay our bills, but in a way, they're our most important segment, right? They're the largest users of our software, and they make up, in orders of magnitude, the number of employees that Preferred has. So the mindset would be the first thing I would say, is just kind of everything is, how does this decision, big or small, affect the caregiver? And then secondly, streamlining the technology so that the technology they're interacting with on day one is, to the greatest extent possible, the same technology that they're going to interact with on day 10, day 90, 180, 2 years. So that means reducing, to the greatest extent possible, the number of softwares you have to interact with. And for HHAeXchange, we don't have every component of home care covered, but the ones that we don't, we really focus on finding the quality partners like showd.me, like other vendors, that can integrate with our technologies in a way that reduces the burden on the caregiver, not having to go to 5 different places to accomplish 5 different tasks, going to one place that can very easily branch off. So the ones that are successful, in my opinion, recognize those two things: the mindset and the reduction in technology to the greatest extent possible.
Yeah, that's great. And to your point, if one agency is doing it and they're doing it well, you've got to be looking at it as well, right? I think that's something that I've certainly seen over the last few years. I know when I started, but not that long ago, but back in 2016, 2017, there was a hesitancy to be willing to explore or look at or review, different types of technology, right? Agencies. Sorry, just trying to close something up over here. Agencies were just hesitant, right? They're like, hey, it's too challenging for us. It's too challenging for the caregivers, right? But I think to your point, there's been a shift there, right? There's been a shift where now agents are saying, wait, if someone gets it right, if someone finds the right applicant tracking system, if someone finds the right, onboarding system, if there's an agency management software that's doing something a little bit better, maybe they've got a mobile, again, even mobile apps weren't so popular a few years ago in this industry, but they've got a mobile app and the caregivers seem to like it. We've got to start looking at those things. So that's a really good point about the fact that, agencies need to be aware of what's going on out there, looking at software constantly. My recommendation, I always say this, is if you're in this industry, no matter what role you're in, whether you're on the finance side, you're doing intake, you're doing recruiting, you're doing coordination, you should be looking at software at least once a month, right? See what's out there, right? It doesn't mean I'm looking to buy something. It doesn't look, but go through the demos, look what's out there, see what's out there, see what people are doing that are innovative. I love to see what's out there. Just the creativity sometimes that you'll find. And again, it doesn't mean you have to make a switch. You can come back to your provider and say, hey, there's a software out there and this is a new feature that they've launched. What do you think about that? So yeah, super helpful on that side. And then the other thing, I think we'll get back to that also. I want to talk a little bit more, start mentioning a little bit about integrations and interoperability. I want to get back to that in a minute. Yeah. But before we get that, Effy, one other question for you. I mean, again, you guys are big and certainly you've found solutions to a lot of problems, but you can't solve every problem, right? I was talking to somebody the other day and we were talking about what we do at showd.me and all that. And I said, well, there's one problem I can't solve. And they said, well, what's that? And I said, I can't create more caregivers, right? Like I don't know if that's a political discussion or economic discussion or whatever it is. Like that's just not something in my control. But maybe give an example or two of some of the challenges that you found that maybe you haven't found a solution for, or maybe you found a creative solution for.
Sure, Avi. I go back to some of the earlier comments I made. I think ideally in a perfect world, if an agency's pipeline is healthy and there's a constant flow of new candidates interested in applying, we, at least for us, we'd be in even a better position than we are because we know that we have to keep that pipeline healthy. But some of the challenges I think that agencies have, and I think, you know, it's certainly something we think about on a regular basis, is even with that healthy pipeline, we still have aides that may ultimately not bring in the documentation that we need, may not use the systems that we've built to submit them, may need to take a much longer period of time than would be ideal. That's something that we just don't have in our control, you know. So the day somebody can figure out the solution, how to sort of wave the magic wand and ultimately get, you know, every candidate who's interested to provide their documentation in good order and be ready for a formal hire within, you know, 48 to 72 hours, obviously that's the day that we've solved the big problem. We have not figured out that yet. We're putting a lot of steps in over the past couple of years to do that, and we're much better off than we would have been had we not. But that's a constant evolving situation where we ideally would like that timing from the moment we become aware of a candidate until ultimately date of hire. We would obviously love to shorten that up.
Yeah, that's great. And I know that, you know, just from working with you guys, I mean, just to point out, one of the areas I think you're probably referencing is, you know, and this is just fascinating to me, and maybe you have a comment or two about it, but when you were looking in the market for the right applicant tracking system, right? And again, for anyone on the call is not familiar with that, what that is, that's the ability to post your jobs out there, whether it's on an Indeed or through ads or things like that, and then receive those applications and start to process those. You didn't find one. Right. And then you made the very significant decision to build your own. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure, Avi. So you're right. There are a number of systems out in the marketplace that, you know, could do an okay job, a decent job. Every agency needs to determine if every platform may or may not work for them. For us, although we did have a platform or two that looked somewhat interesting, it didn't really fit the bill in all areas that we needed. So we had to sit down and say, look, where do we really want to be, you know, in 2 years from now? And knowing that, really backing into, okay, in order to meet that goal, what are the types of things that we would need to have on, you know, an internal technology platform? Both from the onset of us being made aware of a candidate through the entire life cycle of the application, the onboarding, obviously all the recruiting efforts, and ultimately to the very end with the HR department and processing that in a manner that you'll be able to teach that to the candidates, being able to manage it internally, being able to obviously monitor the data. And, you know, Avi, I always talk about the data, how without data, very, very, very hard to grow and to scale. I mean, we live and breathe data every day, and that's one of the reasons we did what we did. So we didn't take the decision lightly. We spent a tremendous amount of time and effort and resources, as you mentioned, to build out, and that's just what worked for us. It doesn't mean that everybody needs to go out and build their own system. Obviously, different needs, different sizes, different markets. So everybody figures out what works for them, and perhaps nothing's perfect. And it's okay not to be perfect. It's okay not to be perfect, but you want to figure out, based on the different components of the pieces that you can put together, ultimately how to end up in a place where it's as well oiled as it can be.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And you know, I think, you know, again, to those who are on the call, you know, not everyone is going to be in a position to sit down and say, hey, we haven't found this offer on the market that's going to satisfy or solve the challenge that we have. So we're going to build our own. So not everyone can do that. But I think going through the exercise though, like you guys did, right, and saying, hey, if we're going to do this at scale and be able to grow, and, you know, again, you know, you mentioned the number of patients you have, right? Or I mentioned the number of caregivers you have, it means that there's a very large pipeline that you need. And to your point, you need data, right? Where are they coming from? right? Are we getting them through online ads? Are we getting them through Indeed? Are we getting through other job boards? Are we getting them through events, right? If we show up at a job fair, do we get people from there? Our relationships with schools, I've got a billboard, subway ads. We've all seen them, right? So, but being able to really figure that out and say, okay, what's getting in the door, and then how does that convert and transfer and all those other things? I think everyone can do that, I think is your point, right? Everyone could and should be doing it. If you only have a small agency with 30, 40 patients, you should still be trying to figure out how are we getting these candidates in the door. You don't need to build your own software because you're not that large, but you need to be thinking about those things. I think that's really great. I appreciate that, and that really leads into our final question for you, John. Let's talk about technology, right? Some people on this call, might take some inspiration from some things Effy said and say, hey, maybe we need to find, think about data, right? And have those dashboards available, and whether it's go out and build our own software, which again, being in the software industry, I don't recommend people do. It's a big undertaking. But also finding it, right? There are pieces you could put together, and sometimes we find some really creative ways that agencies are leveraging software. What are some tips you can have for agencies looking to maybe improve their recruiting, improve their onboarding, improve their agency management when they're looking at some of the new technologies out there?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is for the data side first. I'll answer that first. Find a low cost entry to data, right? Everyone, I think, initially gets scared at, oh man, I got to hire developers. I got to hire a back end. I've got to figure out how to data warehouse. I've got to figure out to replicate my data. I mean, you really, in a lot of ways, don't need to do that. I mean, most agency management softwares, us included, we have a fairly low cost entry into data analysis and BI. We have a dashboarding tool, right? And others do as well. But it's a way to visualize your data, low cost. No need to hire third-party consultants, third-party developers to do it. We've done the work, right? And you can begin to visualize your data. The easiest example that I was talking to someone this morning about is if you want to visualize your EVV compliance, right? You can go run a report that says John Smith has 80% compliance for the previous 30 days, right? But if you want to visualize EVV, you've got to say, well, this one coordinator who really has the most direct influence on these 50 caregivers, this coordinator has 60% compliance across their caregivers compared to another coordinator who only has 80, right? This is something that running reports is not going to give you that insight into, but it's something that BI and dashboarding can. So find a low cost way into it. Talk to your vendor and see if they have one. Second, and I meant to say this earlier, you brought it up again, Avi, thank you. If you can't find one solution that does everything, make sure that one solution can integrate and be interoperable, right? I mean, it's the most overused word in technology is integration, but it's also the most powerful, right? Because if you do it well, then there's really no limit to the great connections you can make with different partners in the industry and find the best in class person for that one thing that your primary solution doesn't do. And we leverage that notion heavily. We embrace that heavily for the things that we can accomplish, that we don't have the time to accomplish, that we just know we can't compete against. Then we try to make a tight integration, one that reduces the errors, one that makes sense, one that can be very easily outlined. If you can't put down on paper how this integration works and easily explain it to someone, to me, you're not integrated, right? If you don't understand what's coming in and where it's going to go and how it's going to end up, you're kind of back at the beginning. So find a low cost entry to BI. And secondly would be find a way to integrate with best in class providers when you find a gap in your technology.
And would you have that? Just, I guess, one follow up, and then I see there's a number of questions we have in QA. I want to make sure we get to those. Would you have that as a criteria? I mean, I still come across, I mean, we get to talk to lots of software providers on a daily basis, and we'll still find some, and I'm sure you guys have the same experience, that don't have those open APIs, haven't really thought through interoperability, which I like a little more than integration, because I think integration is sort of that first level. Interoperability is that sort of back and forth, right? You want to have like the flow there. Should that become like a defining criteria right now? Like if you don't have, if a vendor doesn't have that, then we can't work with you.
In a lot of ways, yes. I mean,
Okay.
we have dedicated teams to that entire process. We didn't have that
Mhm.
2 years ago. So yeah, if the resources that we're expending on it is a reflection of that, absolutely. To us, it is.
Got it. Excellent. Excellent. Effie, John, thank you so much. I got a lot of insight, and I've already spoken to you guys a couple of times about this topic. So really, really appreciate you sharing. We've got a number of people who posted questions here. So I'm just going to move over to the questions over here. See what you got. I think some really interesting questions I can see here that I would love to throw over to you guys. Effie, the first one I'm gonna run to you because I know you deal with this a lot. But how do you accommodate applicants with language barriers? Right. I mean, again, I hear this all the time, right? And there's certainly, depending on what state you're in, right, the language differences will differ. In New York, of course, we get so many different, we've got, Spanish and Russian and Mandarin and Creole and all those others, but there's others out there as well. How do you guys accommodate those language barriers?
I mean, for us, we obviously have a fairly sizable staff, and we've got obviously individuals that speak a multitude of languages. So we're able to set up teams not just on onboarding, but in other disciplines throughout the company to be able to, at the end of the day, have a very strong level of communication, with our field team. So that's it's very, very important. It doesn't mean that we've got every language covered. It doesn't mean that we've got every language covered as well as an agency that predominantly focuses on one specific nationality. But it does mean that we're gonna do our best to accommodate our patients, because you have the same language barrier very often over there, and our caregivers. So that's how we have to look at our day. Our day is about being able to satisfy the requirements of patients, but caregivers as well. Yeah,
that's great. Kind of, you got to meet them. You got to meet them where they are, right? John, I'm going to throw this one at you, but maybe you let me know if you feel comfortable. Otherwise, I can take it back to you mentioned a few times EVV, right? And that's certainly one of the things I think a lot of agencies are sort of struggling with, right? Is, hey, you got to move off of paper. You got to move off of some of these other ways that we've been clocking in and clocking out. The government, Medicare, Medicaid dollars have to be spent, properly, accurately, and that's what the government wants to see, and therefore they've mandated EVV in a number of states, and that's going to continue. But how do you balance that, right? So, and I'm sure you get this question, right? Yes, we want 100% compliance. We want all of our caregivers to clock in and clock out using a mobile device, because that's the accurate way, right? But how patient should you be? How do you avoid alienating? What's been the recommendations that Exchange has given to agencies that have wanted to become more compliant, but certainly get some pushback from their employees?
Well, I think from our seat, a caregiver will get paid faster if they're confirming in real time. If your goal is to ensure that you get paid for all the shifts you work in the fastest time possible, then there's an inherent lag with timesheets. So if you want to go down that road of submitting a timesheet and then getting paid subsequently, great. But if you confirm in real time, you get paid faster. So from our side, it's, that's one thing. Secondly is EVV is kind of the technology that you can piggyback other things onto, right? So just to take our mobile app, for example, it's not just an EVV tool. I think of it as a tool for employment, right? So if you can get someone on this tool for employment, then they can conduct EVV, yeah, but they can also see their compliance information. They can also communicate with their coordinator. They can also submit their duty sheets. They can also launch their in-service right from there, right? So they can do insert the blank, all these other things that come on the back of EVV. So that's how I think of it, is get these tools, start using these tools, because you can do so many other things in conjunction with it.
Got it. Yeah. So it sounds like, you're saying use the carrot as much as possible, right? So if there's other benefits, right, that you can sort of explain to your caregivers, hey, using EVV means you'll get paid more accurately, faster. Have maybe even, again, if you're partnering, I know a lot of agents are now partnering with, same day pay kinds of companies. Maybe you get more access to that money, right? So you're saying yeah, you don't want to alienate your aide. So, find those things that you can use as a carrot and say, hey, there's other things. And I guess that's a real message to agencies, right? If you are pushing the EVV mandates, yeah, perhaps find ways. And again, everyone's challenged on the the comp side, or being able to compensate more, but it doesn't always have to be compensation. There's other benefits as well, like you said. If you're using it properly, that's a good one. Evy, I have a couple questions here, really around, I think, something you touched on, but again, maybe give a couple examples a little bit later down the road. A few questions here around retention, right? So we focus a lot, again, the topic today is speed to hire, getting people on board. But I think one of the reasons why we have the hiring challenges we have is because we sort of have this revolving door, right? And I think we spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, hiring, but I think you can actually help your hiring cause if you can also sort of address your retention challenges. What are some of the things that you do at Preferred that you're comfortable sharing around retaining home healthcare aides, so that you're not constantly just hiring just to simply backfill the ones who have left?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think, our mindset, and perhaps others share this as well, is we're not necessarily hiring for the open cases we have tomorrow or next week. We're really hiring for the long haul. So we monitor retention very carefully. We monitor not just to make hires, but ultimately, are we putting our staff to work? The efforts that we put into the onboarding are only going to bear fruit as strong as the retention program is. And I tend not to use the term retention related to trying to get them back after they've left. We try to sort of use the retention term in terms of maintaining their satisfactory relationship with us, or even enthusiastic relationship with us. So you want to try to build out the best experience. And it might sound, very simple and not overcomplicated, but from the perspective of an employee who basically never needs to come into the office, doesn't have a relationship with colleagues inside the office, their touch point with you is their coordinator, their supervisor, depending on obviously what state you're in and how you refer to your coordinator. But that's their point of contact. They have a patient, they look to opportunities for additional cases. We try to manage, obviously, the ability of an aide to work together with a patient and a patient need. So we try to think as creatively as we can to build out a good experience. That in the past, we talk about intangibles versus tangibles. The tangible things are things that we all have to be mindful of. That's things like getting their paycheck right, making sure their benefits are in place, making sure they have the proper usage allowances. Then you have the intangibles, and the intangibles are things like when they call you, make sure there's someone there to answer the phone. When they have a problem, make sure there's somebody there that can solve the problem. And if someone that answers the phone can't solve that problem, make sure that we actually get them to someone who can try to help them. There's a lot there that you'll be surprised in terms of what the intangibles can do to solidify a relationship.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's probably worth following up with that and mentioning that we had a client, one of our large agencies, reach out recently, and I was so impressed by this. And they said, hey, we went out and we found a customer service training that we want every one of our office staff to take. Right? They had done their research and they went out there and they said, we found this customer service training, and hey, can you host it on your platform? Right? And that's all. So I was impressed. Usually they come to us and say, hey, can you find something? But here the agency knows their culture, knows their employees, knows what they're looking for, went out there and came back and said, hey, we found this series of courses. Every single one of our office staff is going to go through this training because we believe it's going to improve the conversation, improve the outlook or the mindset of that person answering that phone, answering the email. I was so impressed by that, just that whole mindset. So I think what you're saying is, again, you've got to sort of instill in your office staff that these people, like you said, are out in the field. They're not in office. We're in the office. We can find a solution. If not from the first person, I'll ask the second person, third person, fourth person. But if you're on the field, your coordinator is your point of contact. And if your coordinator is not available, then the agency's got to make sure there's someone else to talk to, because they're maybe, yeah, I mean, it might be something as challenging. And again, we think of it as a simple thing, but as challenging as, my transit card's not working. Well, guess what? Your transit card's not working. You can't get to work, can't get home from work, right? That's a big deal, and someone needs an answer as soon as possible. I'm gonna just go to a couple other questions. If we don't get to all the questions, I'll certainly make sure that we follow up with some people. Maybe we'll do one more question here right now. And this question is really around, shortening that time to hire, right? And how do you sort of shorten that? We talked about, the industry average being over a week, right? A week long. And I want to mention something from our perspective. And again, I could throw it to you guys if you've got other thoughts as well. Maybe you agree or disagree. I remember back in 2005, 2006, I was working for a technology company, and engineers. There was a shortage of engineers at the time. I think there still is, but similar to caregivers, a lot of competition, a lot of people trying to find different ways, bonuses, incentives, and things like that. And we create a process called hiring for wow, which is try to convince those engineers to come work for our company versus another, which I think is something agencies do today, right? Again, we don't call it hiring for wow, but not every agency is the same, right? You should come work for a Preferred versus another agency or whatever it is, right? So that's part of your recruiting process. But then it was taking too long, right? They were just spending so much time sort of buttering up these candidates and trying to convince them to come work for us. We had to institute another program called hiring for now, right? So we had hiring for wow, but then we had to do hiring for now, because you can't, by the time they're finished buttering up and explaining all the benefits and perks and all those other things, they went and took a job someplace else. So I know, and again, you guys can add on, I know that what we're seeing from agencies that are handling this well is knowing the whole workflow and making sure it keeps going, right? So, John, you talked about interoperability and integration, right? So, how do you make sure the process just keeps going from one step to another? They've applied, great. Someone's got to review that within a half hour. Someone's got to review that within 45 minutes and see if they're qualified or not. Move them along the process. Someone's got to follow up with them. Someone's got to call them. Someone's got to interview them. Someone's got to send them their paperwork. Someone's got to check their paperwork, right? There's just, I think the way that you cut down on the amount of time it takes is simply making sure that there's no lag in the process. As soon as they're done one step, and we're talking about, Efy, you've mentioned a few times, probably 45, 50 different things that have to happen, right? Between paperwork and signatures and, medicals and things like that. There's a lot that has to happen. But my impression is the ones who are doing it well are just making sure that it never stops, right? They're constantly getting that communication and it never stops. Thoughts on that? Efy, I'll throw it to you first.
Yeah, I mean, there's no perfect answer. We try to take the approach, not just understanding. We do this across different areas of the company. We try to understand not just the what, but also the why. So the what here is things take time. They don't move as fast as we'd like. We know that everyone has recruiters or onboarders who will call and reach out, and sometimes they'll respond, we're working on it, call us back in a day. They don't respond. They give us an answer that something to the effect of something will be in receipt of something today. It doesn't always obviously work out that way. Much of the time it doesn't. So we try to understand the why. We try to understand, what's going on that this is taking time? Is it, for example, that they just cannot get their medicals together? Is it that they can't get to the location in terms of travel? Is it an issue in terms of, they may be entertaining another industry that may have a higher compensation scale? So we're trying to understand from the perspective of the candidates, what is the delay and why is there a delay? We do the same thing, obviously, and we don't experience it the same, but obviously if anyone out there is trying to deal with corporate hires, you may not experience the same things the same way. Somebody who's looking for a specific position as a marketer or an HR manager or a compliance position, they may not be looking for another job in a completely different industry. This is the industry that they've got experience in. This is what they see as their future. It doesn't always necessarily translate that way for the HHAs and the PCAs. They may be considering another industry. So at the same time that they're looking to be employed by Alexa, they may be looking to another industry that has a similar compensation scale. So we have a different set of challenges specifically. for us, by trying to understand why, we're trying to work with the why, talk to them about the why when we were able to converse with them and we're able to communicate with them, and try to, once we understand what the why is, try to help move that along if ultimately they really do have an interest. And if they have concerns, which are certainly justifiable, try to alleviate those concerns. But you're always going to be dealing in a situation, certainly in our industry, where they're not exclusively, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, as a new candidate, absolutely married to the idea of for certain going into our industry. They're constantly hearing about other opportunities as well. So we've got our own set of areas that we need to focus on with this specific point, and trying to understand their mindset can often help.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, understand the why. That's a fantastic point. Where's the breakdown? Why is that happening? How can we fix that? I'm just going to answer one last question here and wrap it up. Certainly appreciate you guys so much, Efy, John. This has been great, and I think the audience, based on the feedback I'm seeing and the questions I'm seeing, have really appreciated it. There's a couple questions we won't get to. We will certainly follow up with you on those. This last one's an interesting one, so I'll just address it based on our experience at showd.me. And the question is, are you hiring people with HHA certifications, or are they getting certified afterwards? And I think that's a really, really good question that I think agencies need to do a little bit of a better job of addressing. One of the ways that I think agencies are successful at the onboarding and orientation process and getting that conversion that they want, that applicant to get hired, is by differentiating at the outset, right? So, again, you have to ask that question right at the outset, right? Do you have a valid HHA certificate? Do you have a valid physical, right? If you have those things, great, we can speed this along, right? If you don't have those things, you need to go down another funnel, down another path, right? Get those, we can help you. Maybe we have relationships with schools. Maybe we've got relationships with urgent care, as Efy mentioned before. We can help you get those things, but you're not quite ready for our onboarding and orientation process yet. You're still in sort of a qualified candidate category. So I know from our experience working with agencies, we've seen that agencies are very successful when they differentiate those right at the outset. You've got your certificate, you've got your up-to-date medical, fantastic. Let's move you down the path. If not, let's use a different group, perhaps, maybe not recruiters or coordinators, to help you get that certificate you want, help join the industry, which is great, and get the physical that you need. So yeah, to that question, I would say again, you can work with both. And I think every agency does work with both, right? If somebody applies and they want to work for your agency, great, help them get that certificate, but don't treat everyone the same, because it's going to be a much longer process for that person who doesn't currently have a certificate or physical than that person who's ready to start working tomorrow. Don't put them in the same bucket. This has been great. I really appreciate it. Thank you, all of you who joined today. Really appreciate you coming. Efy, John, you guys have been fantastic. Thanks so much for joining. And yeah, maybe we'll get you for a future webinar down the road. But again, our next one is on May 10th, and I look forward to talking to everyone then. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks all.